The fog off the Isles of Scilly does not sound like danger. It sounds like nothing at all. Just water slapping wood, a rope creaking, and somewhere below deck, a bell being struck to mark the hour. On the night of October 22nd, 727, that bell was the only clock the entire British fleet had to trust, and no one aboard the Flagship Association knew it was about to be wrong by nearly 30 miles. Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel stood on deck as the fleet came home from Gibraltar, 4 ships strong, the Channel fog pressing in close enough to taste salt on the back of the throat. He had done this crossing dozens of times. His navigators had done the math the only way anyone could in 1707, counting knots on a log line, watching a sandglass drain, listening for the ship's bell to mark each half hour, and from all of that, guessing where they were, because latitude, the distance north or south, was easy enough to read from the stars. Longitude, how far east or west a ship had traveled, required something almost impossible to have on a rolling, salt-soaked deck, a clock that could keep perfect time for weeks, so a captain could compare the hour at sea to the hour back home and turn that difference into distance. There was no such clock in 1707, so Shovel's fleet steered by their best guess, confident they were safely south of the rocks. Records show that within hours the Association struck the outer Gilstone Rock and sank in minutes, taking nearly all hands with her. 3 more ships went down with her that same night. Historians still debate the exact death toll, but most estimates place it between 1,400 and 2,000 men, one of the worst naval disasters in British history, and it happened not because of an enemy storm or mutiny, but because no clock on Earth could tell a sailor what time it was somewhere else. That single failure, a bell that could not answer a question the whole world was quietly asking, is where this story really begins. Not with Shovel, but with a much older, much stranger question. What does it mean to actually know what time it is, and who decided we needed to know it all? Long before Shovel's bell rang out over the Scilly rocks, time was something you watched rather than something you owned. Ancient farmers read the sun's shadow. Egyptian priests marked hours with dripping water clocks called clepsydrae, so precise that some divided the night into 12 parts regardless of season. But none of these devices traveled. None of them survived a storm. The idea of a machine that could carry time inside itself, tick by tick, wherever it went, belonged to a much later and much quieter place, a monastery. Medieval monks needed to wake for prayer at exact hours, day and night, through every season, in complete darkness. Sundials were useless after sunset. So sometime in the late 13th century, European craftsmen, no single inventor's name survives with certainty, began building mechanical clocks driven by a falling weight and a device called an escapement, which let that weight fall in small regular clicks instead of one continuous rush. Records at Salisbury Cathedral in England describe a clock built around 1386 that had no face and no hands at all. It existed only to ring a bell, marking hours for monks who could not see the sky. Remarkably, that clock, after restoration work over the centuries, is often cited as among the oldest working clocks in the world, and it is still ticking inside that cathedral today. From monasteries, the mechanical clock crept into town squares. A public clock became a statement of civic pride, and then, slowly, a tool of civic control. A town that could ring a shared hour could open its markets together, close its gates together, call its workers together. But there was one place the mechanical clock could not go, no matter how finely built, the deck of a ship. A pendulum clock depends on gravity swinging evenly, and a ship rolling on ocean swells destroys that rhythm completely. Salt air corrodes metal. Temperature swings from tropical heat to icy storms expand and contract every year. For 400 years after the first tower clocks rang out over European cities, the sea remained a place where no clock could survive, which meant longitude remained, in practical terms, unsolvable. This is the first turn of the screw. After the Scilly disaster, Britain finally admitted this was not a minor inconvenience. It was killing sailors by the thousands, wrecking merchant fortunes, and threatening a nation whose entire power depended on ships crossing oceans without getting lost. In 1704, Parliament passed the Longitude Act, offering a reward of up to £20,000, an almost unimaginable fortune at the time, worth millions today, to anyone who could devise a reliable method for finding longitude at sea. A Board of Longitude was assembled to judge the entries, staffed largely by astronomers, including men who had worked alongside Isaac Newton. Nearly everyone on that board believed the answer would come from the stars, from careful measurements of the moon's position against fixed stars, a method requiring years of astronomical tables and a trained navigator doing complex calculations on a rocking deck. Almost no one believed the answer would come from a clock, and certainly no one expected it to come from a carpenter's son in rural Lincolnshire who had never attended university and had built his first clocks almost entirely out of wood. His name was John Harrison, born in 693, and by the time the Longitude Act passed, he was already known locally for clocks so precise they barely needed adjusting from one year to the next. He believed, against the prevailing wisdom of the board, that the solution to longitude was not more astronomy, it was a better machine. A clock, immune to temperature, immune to motion, immune to the sea itself. He spent the next several decades of his life pursuing that single idea with an intensity that bordered on obsession. His first attempt, a massive brass machine called H1, was finished in 1735 and tested at sea successfully, but Harrison himself was unsatisfied and refused to call it finished. He built H2, then scrapped major elements and built H3, spending nearly 20 years total refining mechanisms most clockmakers of his era could barely imagine, including compensating balances designed to counteract temperature changes that would otherwise expand or contract metal parts and throw off the timing. Each version was smaller, tighter, more elegant than the last, and still, the board wanted more proof. Then, in 1759, Harrison finished something entirely different. Not a room-sized machine, but a watch. Called H4, it looked almost like an oversized pocket watch about 5 inches across, a radical departure from everything that came before it. In 1761, Harrison's son William carried H4 aboard a ship bound for Jamaica to put it to the ultimate test. Over 81 days at sea, through heat, storms, and the relentless motion of the Atlantic, H4 lost just 5 seconds. 5 seconds, over 81 days, translated into a positional error of only about 1¼ nautical miles, an accuracy no one on the board had thought physically possible from a mechanical device. By any reasonable measure, John Harrison had solved one of the greatest scientific problems of his age. And this is where the story stops sounding like triumph and starts sounding like something closer to injustice. The Board of Longitude, and in particular its most influential member, the astronomer Neville Maskelyne, was reluctant to accept that a watchmaker with no formal education had beaten the finest astronomers in Europe. Maskelyne, who became Astronomer Royal in 1765, championed the lunar distance method he had spent years developing, publishing detailed tables in his own nautical almanac starting in 1767, a method that, not incidentally, kept astronomers and their observatories central to navigation rather than a single mechanical object built in a workshop. Historians still debate how much of Maskelyne's resistance was genuine scientific caution about relying on a single watch and how much was professional self-interest in a method he had personally built his reputation on. What the records do show clearly is this. Harrison was made to disassemble his own watch for inspection, forced to build duplicate copies to prove the design could be repeated, and paid only partial installments of the prize money despite trial after trial confirming H4's extraordinary accuracy. By the early 1770s, John Harrison was nearly 80 years old, his eyesight failing, decades of his life spent proving a point the world seemed determined not to fully credit. In 1772, in what must have felt like a final act of desperation, he appealed directly to King George III. Legend has it, and Harrison family accounts later recorded, that the king personally tested one of Harrison's watches, H5, at his private observatory in Kew, and reportedly declared after watching its accuracy for himself that Harrison had been treated unfairly. With royal pressure behind him, Parliament finally granted Harrison a payment in 1773 in recognition of his achievement, not, technically, the full Longitude Prize itself, which historians note was, by strict rule, never formally awarded to anyone. Harrison died 3 years later in 1776 on his 83rd birthday. It would be easy to end the story there. An underdog vindicated, a stubborn genius finally recognized, a clock that saved sailors from the fate of the association. And all of that is true. But it is not the whole shape of what happened next, because the very quality that made Harrison's clock revolutionary, its unshakable portable precision, was about to be turned toward a purpose no one on that storm-tossed deck off Scilly could have imagined. Because while Harrison's chronometers were slowly making their way onto Royal Navy ships, Captain James Cook carried a copy of Harrison's design, built by the instrument maker Larcom Kendall, on his Pacific voyages in the 1770s, praising its accuracy in his own journals. A very different transformation was happening on land. The mechanical clock, born centuries earlier to call monks to prayer, had already spread from cathedral towers into town halls, and now, with the Industrial Revolution gathering speed, it moved into something new, the factory. A ship's clock tells you where you are. A factory clock tells you when to begin, when to stop, and how much of your day belongs to someone else. Historians studying this period, notably the British historian E.P. Thompson, in his influential work on time and industrial labor, have documented how factory owners in the 18th and 19th centuries used clocks and bells not simply to coordinate work, but to instill an entirely new discipline in workers who had previously measured their days by daylight, seasons, and task completion rather than minutes and hours. Clocking in, clocking out. Time itself became currency, something to be spent, saved, wasted, stolen. The very precision Harrison had fought his whole life to achieve at sea was, on land, becoming a tool of control as much as coordination. This is the turn that changes what the whole story means. The clock that Harrison built to rescue lost sailors and the clock that rang over a factory floor demanding punctuality were, in the end, the same invention, doing the same fundamental thing, replacing human judgment about roughly when with an unforgiving, external, exactly when. At sea, that precision saved lives. On land, it disciplined bodies. The very object that let Captain Cook chart the Pacific with unprecedented accuracy was, in its landlocked cousin, also the object standing over factory workers, demanding they arrive before the bell and not a minute later. Precision, it turns out, is not automatically freedom. It depends entirely on who is holding the clock and who is being told what time it is. As ships and railways multiplied through the 19th century, the problem returned in a new form. Not longitude this time, but simple coordination. Britain's railway companies in the 1840s discovered that towns just a few miles apart kept slightly different local times based on the sun, and a train timetable built on that patchwork was a recipe for collisions. Railway companies began adopting a single standard time, synchronized by telegraph, spreading what became known as railway time across the country. That local solution eventually scaled to something global. In 1884, delegates from around the world gathered in Washington, D.C. for the International Meridian Conference and formally agreed to use the observatory at Greenwich, England as the reference point for Greenwich Mean Time, dividing the entire planet into time zones measured against that single line. It is worth pausing on that fact, the reason the world agrees, today on what time it is anywhere, traces directly back through Greenwich, through the Astronomer Royal's Observatory, through the very institution that once resisted crediting a carpenter's watch with solving the problem it existed to solve. And the lineage did not stop with Greenwich. Every GPS satellite orbiting the Earth today carries an atomic clock inside it, keeping time accurate to within a few billionths of a second. Your phone calculates your location not by measuring distance directly, but by comparing the precise time signals from multiple satellites and calculating how far each signal must have traveled to reach you at that exact instant. The exact same logic. Harrison spent his life trying to put inside a 5-inch watch, compare a known time to a local time, and the difference tells you where you are. When your map app quietly finds you on a city street today, it is running, underneath all the software, on the same principle a carpenter's son proved correct on a ship bound for Jamaica in 1761. That is, perhaps, the reason this story still matters far beyond old ships and old watches. Almost everything about how we live now. When we wake, when trains and flights depart, when a meeting starts across 3 time zones, even how our phones silently know where we stand on a map depends on the assumption that time can be trusted absolutely, kept identically everywhere, agreed upon instantly. That trust did not always exist. It was built, argument by argument, failure by failure, across centuries, starting with monks who needed to pray in the dark and ending, so far, with satellites that never sleep. We rarely think about it, the way we rarely think about the ground holding us up. But every calendar notification, every arriving in 12 minutes, every synchronized clock on every wall in every country descends from that same unbroken thread. What lingers most from this story is not really the technology, but the human cost stitched through every layer of it. A fleet lost off the Scilly rocks because no clock could survive the sea. A stubborn craftsman spending nearly 50 years of his life proving that a small machine could do what the finest astronomers said was impossible, and a king who had to personally intervene before that craftsman was believed. It is also the quiet, uncomfortable truth underneath the triumph, that the same precision which rescues a lost ship can, in different hands, become the bell that governs a worker's every hour. The clock did not choose whether it would set us free or keep us in line. It only kept time. We decided what to do with it. Somewhere beneath the water off the Isles of Scilly, the wreck of the Association still rests on the seafloor, close to rocks. A working chronometer would have warned Sobel away from decades before one existed. There is no way to know, and every historian who studies that wreck will tell you plainly that we cannot know, whether a Harrison watch built 40 years earlier could have saved those 1,400 lives or more. But it is hard not to wonder, standing at the edge of that unanswerable question, what a single ticking machine, small enough to fit in a coat pocket, might have changed about that foggy October night, and what it says about us, that it took a shipwreck of that size before anyone was willing to fund the answer. So, the next time a notification quietly tells you exactly what time it is, somewhere between waking and sleeping, it might be worth asking what that certainty actually cost to build and who first paid the price for it. Would you have trusted a carpenter's watch over an astronomer's stars if the lives of 2,000 sailors rested on your answer? And now that time governs almost everything we do without our noticing it at all. Are we the ones keeping the clock, or has the clock, quietly, all along, been keeping us? Main sources for this story include Dava Sobel's book Longitude, the official records and collections of the Royal Museums, Greenwich, the historical archives of Salisbury Cathedral, and E.P. Thompson's essay, Time, Work Discipline, and Industrial Capitalism. The full list is in the description.